24 News Defense. In this edition, the CIA-Saudi connection, decades of close cooperation, and the program that has Riyadh funding U.S. training of Syrian rebels. Focus on Jordan's growing security challenges. For how long can the Hashemite kingdom remain a so-called island of stability? And a conversation with India's former Foreign Secretary, Shiv Shankar Menon. It's no secret that the CIA and Saudi Arabia have had a close relationship over the years, with Riyadh providing the funds to support many shared American interests. But today, especially in Syria, those interests are often conflicting. Here's the story of the recent cooperation to train Syrian rebels. With the ink dry on the nuclear deal with Iran and some conflicting interests in a range of Mideast crises, ties between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are strained. But for decades, that relationship has been a very close one. And these days, the focus is Syria. In 2013, U.S. President Barack Obama gave the CIA a green light to arm Syrian rebels, with funding from a familiar source, the Saudi Kingdom. As reported this week in the New York Times, that mission, called Timber Sycamore, sees the kingdom putting in weapons and substantial funds, estimated at several $1 billion, with the CIA training rebels on assault rifles and anti-tank missiles. Prior to that, Saudi Arabia, along with Qatar, had been sending weapons to Syria for over a year, but the CIA was only authorized to deliver non-lethal aid to rebels. But not everyone in Washington has been on board, with some crying foul over the lack of transparency. In a statement, Democratic Senator Ron Wyden wrote that officials haven't provided the public with details about how this is being done, which U.S. agencies are involved, or which foreign partners these agencies are working with. The alliance was reiterated by the Saudi foreign minister this week, with U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry there trying to calm concerns.
We work with our American friends in these areas in terms of exchange of information, intelligence, in terms of training, in terms of ballistic missile defense, in terms of enhancing our defensive capabilities. We work with our American friends on trying to find a way to remove Bashar al-Assad from Syria.
It's far from being the first cooperation between Riyadh and Washington in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia has helped bankroll American interests for decades. One of the most obvious examples, Afghanistan in the 1980s. Both nations threw support behind the Afghan Mujahideen fighting the Soviet occupation. For Riyadh, that amounted to some $4 billion in official aid alone. By the mid-1990s, the rise of the Taliban helped fill the void. Today, the picture in Syria is even more complex, with a host of other nations deeply involved, including Saudi Arabia's ultimate rival, Iran, and Russia, with Washington walking a fine line in between them all. And many of the same questions are relevant, like which groups should be supported, how to do it, and who can put Syria back together in the future. And Barak Siner, an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, joins me now. Barak, good evening. Thanks for being with me. So we're talking about decades of close cooperation between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. In this very complex picture today, what is the U.S. relying on the kingdom for?
In an age where the US is increasingly slashing its defense expenditure, it's relying on local actors in order to engage in the region. It's traditionally relied on Saudi Arabia to project power into the region and to underpin its security architecture. As that's manifested in various forms such as training and increased, expanded weapons sales to the region. At the same time, however, the US is contradicting its foreign policy because while on one hand it's relying on the Sunni to project its power into the region, and it's also relying on the Sunni rebels in Syria, simultaneously it's allowing Russia to have a free hand. And Russia, like Iran, want to uphold and prop up the Assad regime. So this is a very, very sclerotic foreign policy. This leads Saudi Arabia to feel increasingly alienated from the West and increasingly undertake its own foreign policy initiatives. So it will intervene in Bahrain, it will clamp down on Shia, it will execute a Shia preacher. It will
without much reaction from the United States.
Without much reaction from the United States, and it will also put together an alliance to counter what they perceive as a Shia threat. They see a broader context. They see that when the Revolutionary Guard fires rockets very close to the USS Truman and there's no US response, then they think to themselves, we can't rely on we can't rely on the United States, and we have to take increasingly confrontational actions without running it past the United States.
And you mentioned U.S. defense expenditure actually lessening now. Now of all times, with the Mideast in such chaos and the U.S. involved, why now?
Due to this sequester is also as a result of the global financial downturn. So therefore, you will hear the United States speak about soft power, smart power, which is clearly branding for the need to substitute for real hard power, i.e. military expenditure. You've heard Leon Panetta say that the United States needs to rely on local actors or even Saudi Arabia to fund or place their soldiers into the fray. It's highly unlikely, and in that midst you have a huge power vacuum that is being created. You're having China entering that power vacuum, and it perceives Iran as being a key component in its Silk Road strategy. So it's developing infrastructure there, roads, aeroplane parts, oil refineries, etc., etc. You're seeing at the same time an oil price war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, with Saudi Arabia feeling that its OPEC leadership is increasingly threatened. All these things lead to increased confrontation. So
the bottom line I'm getting from what you're saying is that the U.S. sort of confused policy, this policy walking a fine line between Saudi Arabia, like in the CIA story we just aired, and between sort of betting on the Iranian horse, it's not working so well, that policy.
We see increasingly local actors taking independent initiatives without running it past the United States. We're seeing international actors with geopolitical vyings in the region. When American primacy is taken out of the equation, and you're seeing a parity between local actors with international actors entering the fray. You're seeing really pre-World War I scenario of nation-state actors in an incredibly volatile region. Confrontation increases, threat increases. So one needs primacy in order to create stability. Once that's removed from the mix, then risk and confrontation takes its place.
And very briefly, do you think stability is anywhere near in the near future?
No, it's increasingly unstable. We also have one final point. When Saudi Arabia feels that its reserves also are dwindling because of the oil price war, then you're going to see unpredictable and desperate measures taken in absence of consultancy with the United States, leading to increased confrontation.
Barak Sinor, thank you very much for this.
Thank you.
Moving now to Jordan. 1 year ago, Jordan was stunned by the horrific video of one of its Air Force pilots burned to death at the hands of the Islamic State terror group. That sparked protests and strong statements, but the country has remained relatively stable amid the total chaos in its neighborhood. But can it last? Dov Lieber takes a look.
The Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan has managed to remain an island of stability in a Middle East ravaged by political upheaval and war. But today, Jordan is facing a long list of threats casting a shadow over the kingdom's future. The Islamic State terror group has declared its intentions to conquer Jordan, and with IS fighting just across the northern border in Syria and eastern border in Iraq, it's well positioned to open up a new battlefront with the Hashemite Kingdom. Last week, Israel Army's chief of staff argued that recent setbacks in Syria may not bode well for everyone.
The success against ISIS raised the probability, in my eyes, that we will see them turning their guns both against us and against the Jordanians.
But most security experts believe IS won't be able to penetrate Jordan, not with a US-funded and trained army standing in their way. And if IS is unlikely to significantly harm Jordan from the outside, the turmoil sparked by the wars in Syria and Iraq is threatening to implode Jordan from within. After keeping its borders open to refugees for nearly 2 decades, last week, the country began screening Syrian refugees over fears that the jihadist agents could be hiding among them.
And this is the situation that we're facing in Jordan, where As you may know, we have 1.3 million Syrian refugees. That is 20% of our population. And 90% of those refugees live in our towns and cities. They're not in refugee camps, which has put an immense amount of pressure on our economy, on our social and physical infrastructure.
And the country's own population also presents a concern. Though most Jordanians are strongly against IS, the Hashemite Kingdom has one of the highest number of citizens joining jihadi groups in Iraq and Syria. Only Saudi Arabia and Tunisia send more. So far, there has been no successful Islamic State attack on Jordanian soil since the group's rise. The last attack in Jordan was in 2005, when Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which would later evolve into the Islamic State, claimed credit for the Amman hotel bombings that killed 60 people. With countries crumbling around the kingdom and nearly half of its youth struggling with unemployment, many experts are asking themselves if Jordan's Arab winter is just getting started.
And India is marking its 67th Republic Day, showcasing its military might, with the French President Hollande as its chief guest. The country has made several big defense moves over the past few months. Those include the purchase of 36 French-built Rafale jets this week, a deal for defense technology and civil nuclear cooperation with Japan in December, and successful tests of the Barak 8 missile system developed alongside Israel. And earlier this week, during his visit to Israel, we spoke with Shivshankar Menon, India's former foreign secretary and former national security advisor to Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. Mr. Menon, thanks very much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
So what is the view from your region on the religious war tearing up the Middle East in 2016?
Well, I think it affects us in two direct ways. One is, the Middle East has always been very important to us. There are about 7 million Indians who live and work in the Middle East, and they are a major source of remittances, over $35 billion last year home. We get about 70% of our oil gas imports from the Middle East. So stability here really matters to us, and this population is also at risk of radicalization, of being targets of attack, and so on. Secondly, when we see the turmoil in the Middle East, it actually comes to India through Pakistan and Afghanistan, which already are fairly troubled societies. There are very strong terrorist groups there which have been crossing the border and attacking India for many years. So the more turmoil there is in the Middle East, the more security problems for us. We have a big interest actually in stability in the Middle East, and we try and work with our partners. One result is, and Israel is central to this, that we do a lot more work on counterterrorism, on defense and security cooperation with partners in the Middle East, partners like Israel. And Israel is a country that we've worked with for a very long time on these issues.
So when India looks at the parties to this war, the Shiite axis headed by Iran on one hand, and then the Sunni, do you favor any party? Do you think one should be supported over the other?
Not really. Frankly, it doesn't. For us, we would much rather that the fighting didn't take place, that the Middle East was much more stable. Now, no, that's an impossible hope, you would say, in today's situation. So I don't think we choose sides in in religious conflicts. Frankly, for us, it's a problem that religion is used as an excuse to achieve political and other gains by radicals, by terrorist groups, by extremist groups. And that's something that for us is a real problem, because it gets exported to India through our expatriate population, through the diaspora, also through Pakistan, through Afghanistan. So we will work with all our friends to try and make sure that this conflict, as you said, will be dampened down and that stability returns.
And let's speak about Tehran. What will the lifting of sanctions on Iran do for its relations with India?
Well, I think for us, Iran used to be and still is a relatively important source of energy supplies. It's a big neighbor. She, in the past, has been a stabilizing influence in Afghanistan, which is very important to our security. And frankly, we would hope that she would be a stabilizing influence in the Gulf as well, because that's where these 7 million Indians live and work. We'll have to see how events evolve, and we'll have to see what happens, I think, in the coming years, as whether Iran will concentrate on her own economic and social development, or whether this change in the situation around her, the lifting of sanctions, will lead to other forms of Iranian behavior. I think we have to see.
Mr. Menon, thanks very much for this.
Well, thank you.
And that closes this edition. Find us back here in the Jaffa Port next week for more of the biggest stories in security and defense.